please give a warm welcome to Ashley All.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I'm Ashley All. I'm a communications and strategic communicator in the state of Kansas. I've been doing work around communication and messaging and storytelling for about 20 years now, mostly in the context of political campaigns, but that's not what we're going to talk about today, don't worry. But a couple years ago, I also started working on issue campaigns, public policy, government, nonprofit work, and have realized over the course of that time that a lot of these things are tools and tricks that we can use across our different sectors, whether it's nonprofit, whether it's government work. I want to thank first Elizabeth and Kelly and the entire Sunflower team, and Brandon, who's somewhere in the back, for putting this together. Because one of the things that we found when we first started our organization, Kansas Common Sense Fund, it's a little over a year ago, was that there are a lot of nonprofits, varying in sizes, and some don't necessarily have the communications resources that they need to do all the different things and the expertise. Sometimes you might have a communications director, and sometimes it might be you and one other person, or just you doing all the work yourself. And what we found is the need for both technical support from us, communication support, messaging support, and guidance was something that a lot of organizations really could benefit from. And so that is why we exist in the world. That is our mission, to help all of you. So if you are interested in learning more and working with us, please reach out. I want to thank, again, Sunflower for putting this together, because bringing us all together so that we can learn from each other, talk about our challenges, and a lot of the opportunities that we have to make progress in Kansas, I think is a gift. So thank you. Maybe we'll give them applause, because I think, and I'm sure as you've talked, comparing stories through the week, you've realized that each of our organizations are a collection of stories. It doesn't matter what issue or policy or community you work in, these stories are our life's work and our organization's life's work. And these stories make up who we are. They tell us a lot about the impact of what we do, how we do it, and why. And those stories are how we connect with each other. So 5 years ago, I was kind of at like the pinnacle of what I felt like the pinnacle of my career. And all of that changed in the blink of an eye. I lost my job suddenly, and quite honestly, felt like I lost my identity. And it was an incredibly painful experience. I was heartbroken, but I was also relieved, because my job had become kind of a nightmare. It was not a good environment for me. I was second guessing myself. And through that devastating process, though, I learned a whole lot about me. I learned about failure. I learned about what that means to me personally, but also about integrity and about what is personally important in my life. And that changes your perspective. And so yes, that experience was devastating and painful, but 5 years later, I look back on it with gratitude, because I was able to go on to grad school, and that was a formative experience for me. And I was able to work on some of the most consequential projects and campaigns of my life, all because I lost something. And through that pain, I found my calling. Each of us has a story of disappointment, joy, or achievement. Our organizations have stories, origin stories, stories of overcoming the odds, stories of helping people in our communities. And those stories make us who we are. It makes our organization who they are, whether it's the Kansas Birth Justice Society or the Kansas Breastfeeding Coalition or the Safe Streets Wichita organization or others. Each of these organizations has volunteers, stakeholders, and community members that are dedicated, employees that are dedicated to the people they serve and to the communities they serve. And these stories that each of these different stakeholders have are gold for us when we're trying to connect with each other and the communities that we serve. So just like each of you, I have built, and your organizations, I've built a collection of stories in my life, my professional life, that show the breadth of what my professional experience, the successes I've had, obviously the disappointment I just shared with you, and all of the things I learned along the way. But I also have personal stories as a mother, a dedicated wife, sister, friend, athlete, sports fan, feminist, undercover Taylor Swift fan. Yeah, so all of those stories are much more effective at telling you who I am, what I value, and how what motivates me in the work that I do. And the same is true for each of you and each of your organizations. So I've worked on some pretty complex and polarizing issues in my career. And some of you may not agree with some of those policies. But what I can say is that we have a lot in common. And that is what we all need to utilize and seize upon when we're working and connecting with other people in our community. My family has been living and farming in Osage County for 6 generations. Anybody from Osage County here today? No? What was that?
Anybody knows where it is?
Oh my gosh. That was rude. I'm gonna hold it personally, take that personally. Anyway, so they've been in that, growing up in Osage County for a long time. I was born in Nebraska in a small town, but we moved back when I was about 5. My dad's a newspaper guy, has served in newspapers all over the state, and that's kind of why I got into communications. My daughter's name is Lyndon, which is after a small town in Osage County. When we moved back, I grew up in Newton, Kansas. I went to a Methodist church. My parents taught me about service and faith and community. I started working when I was 14 years old in local businesses. I taught swimming lessons. I waited tables. I even delivered prescription drugs at 16 years old, which, looking back, is a terrible, terrible idea, but I guess it was a different time. I was also, and it was totally sanctioned, to be clear. Okay. I also was an athlete, a swimmer, a basketball player, a cheerleader, and like all kids, I made mistakes, incredibly bad decisions, and had my share of embarrassing moments. Somehow I made it through high school. Does any of that sound familiar? Does anybody have a shared experience? Was there any retired cheerleaders in the room? Yes! Thank you, great. Of course we share these experiences because we're all so much more, we have much more in common than we often think. And those points of similarity, those shared values, those shared experiences are exactly what we must seize upon when we're trying to connect with each other and also our communities. We have stories of loss and disappointment and joy. We also have stories of life-changing wonder. The day of my first daughter Penelope was born, for example. My husband had been in Chicago for the day, watching a Cubs game. It's the annual man trip. And before you get mad at him, like I told him to go, it was 2 days before my due date, go please, stop pacing and staring at me. He left. Of course, as soon as he left, I got really nervous and got very stressed out and started doing what I did when I was pregnant. When I was stressed, which was vacuuming. So I vacuumed the whole house probably twice. And at midnight, he came home, sunburned and exhausted, and all was well, until 5 a.m. the next morning, when I woke up, my water broke, and he was hungover. Anyway, after many hours of labor, Penelope was born. I won't get into the details, but needless to say, that was the most exhausting, excruciating, emotional day of my life. It was also the most empowering and life-changing day of my life. And only to be rivaled with the birth of Penelope's sisters, Sylvia and Georgia, a couple years later. Nothing prepared me for that experience. It fundamentally changed me. It changed my perspective on the world, and it changed my perspective on the inequity in our healthcare system and the importance of autonomy for women. Incorporating those shared stories and experiences is how we forge deeper connections with each other. And it's how we build community. And for our purposes here today, It's how we drive action among donors, among volunteers, and our unique community. So those collections of stories, it's our best possible way to relate with our audiences that we encounter in our work. Oops, I fell behind. I knew it would happen. So today I'm here to talk to you about the power of storytelling and how we can use storytelling in a strategic way to tell our story using to strengthen our organization. By setting a goal, identifying our audience, choosing the right messenger, utilizing the right story to meet our goal. And I'll probably tell some more stories along the way. But first, I'm going to talk about why storytelling is so incredibly important. You may be thinking, I'm not a communicator. I am like the grant writer or the volunteer coordinator or the accountant, whatever it might be. Oftentimes, the executive director, those are the communicators. We are all communicators, and we all have a unique and authentic story to tell, and it's our job to tell it. And storytelling has been central to the human experience for as long as we've existed. It's found in every culture around the globe, and we've been telling stories to teach lessons of survival and to teach lessons and pass on rituals, to promote understanding, and to explain the unexplainable. And our brains are hardwired for it. Psychologist Dr. Roger Schenck argues that storytelling actually creates a memory structure in our brain that sticks with us for the rest of our life. The narrative arc, which is the general flow of a story, is something that connects to our very core. Even the shortest stories, there's a beginning, middle, and end. There's an inciting incident, climax, resolution, tension. And if something's missing in that format, we feel it. It's disorder. We feel that tension. So when information is conveyed in a story arc, we recognize it. That's why we teach important lessons using stories. Bible stories, childhood fables, urban myths, even gossip. We're all conveying information through stories. That's why it sticks. That's why it's so hard to forget some of those ridiculous urban myths, because they're told in a story format. Cognitive psychologists explain it this way, that in our attempt to understand the data that is coming at us and in the world around us, we take those pieces of data and experience and we assemble it in our brain into a story, even sometimes if it's not. I think about my history class in college. I am really bad with numbers and also with dates. And so Russian history in KU was a disaster for me. Names were unfamiliar. The dates went in one ear and out the other. But when my professor told us the story of Catherine the Great in a narrative format, first of all, I was mesmerized. But next, I remembered the sequence of events far better. I could follow the path of her life. I could understand the dates. And science agrees. When understanding or processing is eased, persuasion becomes more likely. If we can understand it, narratives are processed easier than non-narratives. Not only that, stories, specifically stories with emotional triggers, cause a certain reaction in our brain chemistry and in our brain waves. Oops. We present facts like in a lecture style, only like 2 parts of our brain light up. But when we tell a story, all kinds of things activate. For example, cigarette smoke contains 7,000 chemicals. Cigarette smoking is responsible for 90% of lung cancer, 80% of deaths due to chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Smoking-related illness claims the lives of over 480,000 Americans a year and costs the U.S. $289 billion annually in healthcare costs and lost productivity. Pretty bad stats. Should be enough to get anybody to stop smoking or to steer clear of cigarettes, but it's often not. My grandpa smoked for most of his life. We begged him to stop. Multiple times he tried, but he didn't until it was too late. My grandfather died of lung cancer when I was 14 years old. And I vividly remember my sister coming to my high school to get me out of geometry class, tears in her eyes, anxiety on her face as she beckoned me to go. I remember the sound of the machines in his hospital room. And I remember the desperation that I felt waiting for my dad to come home from a work trip. And I remember making the choice not to go into the room with him at the end as the doctors removed the support that was sustaining in his life. The feeling of standing in that hallway alone will never leave me. It was a mix of disappointment in myself for not being brave enough to go in. It was anger at my grandpa for smoking and not stopping. And it was a pain so deep I could hardly breathe. Something I had never experienced in my life to that point. That experience changed me. It changed the way I looked at smoking, and I hope it changes the way you see it as well. Now, combining that personal story with a few of the data points I mentioned is a far more compelling case to stop smoking and avoid cigarettes. It probably connects with a different way. Maybe you have a similar story of loss. Maybe you feel empathy for me and my family in that situation. To the human brain, stories and imagined experiences can be processed the same as real experiences. Stories create genuine emotion and behavioral response in our brain activity. Think about watching a sad movie. We know it's fake. We know it's not really happening, but we feel it. We cry, even. It's called mirroring. In other words, we feel the pain or the joy or the anxiety or the humiliation of the storyteller. And while listening to a compelling story, our brainwaves synchronize with that of the storyteller. It's called neurocoupling. And our brain also releases different hormones as we listen. Dopamine, cortisol, oxytocin, depending on the kind of story we're telling, whether it's sad, scary, joyful, these chemicals are released in response. For example, oxytocin causes us to feel empathy towards the storyteller or the characters. The right story can make our audience connect with us and feel compassion towards our organization or our issue that we're advocating for, just like you might have felt compassion or empathy towards me when I told you the story of my grandfather. And that's important for us here today because it allows us to connect more deeply with each other and our audience, skipping over maybe superficial differences in our core share, and skipping over those differences to our core shared values and experiences. Lastly, we are able to remember information far better if it's delivered in a story format and for a longer period of time. So most people forget more than 40% of what you tell them by the very next day. So I would say probably more, quite honestly, but maybe I have a bad memory. And then a full 90% a week later. Again, probably more, but maybe just me. Stories give you an advantage because the information is 20 times more memorable when told through a story. Different formats are obviously maybe important in certain situations, lists, charts, facts, and maybe in conjunction with a story, but stories wield a particularly strong influence over our behaviors and our attitudes. Data and research are important as a foundation. The information, our story should be based on credible information and fact, but emotion and shared experiences delivered through a story are far more effective and persuasive. It's the secret sauce. Dr. Alan Weiss, a psychologist who studies this, says that logic makes people think and emotion makes people act. So as much as we want to think that we make all of our decisions logically, that's not the case. Oftentimes we make an emotional decision and then we use logic to explain it. There are absolutely times where we want people to think about our issue. to think about the state, to think about research. But in most cases, we also want them to act. We want them to donate. We want them to volunteer. We want them to attend an event, and that requires action. Think of the ASPCA commercials. I actually thought about playing one, but I don't think we could all make it through without tears. They play Sarah McLachlan music. They show us devastating pictures of sweet little animals, and they tell us a really short story. Right now, these animals are being left in the heat with no water and no love. They're suffering alone. They're hanging on by a thread. If you donate, we can save them. And we all donate all our money, right? The ASPCA and their marketing team understand that very, very well, that you can more effectively meet your goal of raising funds if you connect emotionally through a story. Alternatively, they could have just given us some data. 10 million animals die from cruelty and abuse each year in the United States. Donate so we can save them. But one is far more effective. One is more effective in generating connection, engagement, and then finally action. So I'm sure that all of you can think of other commercials or situations where emotion is used to either sell a product, an idea, whether it's fear, anger, uncertainty, hope, empathy. Emotions often are more effective than logic. And when combined as a story, it's a powerful combination. So during your sessions this week, we've discussed messaging, volunteer engagement, donor management, fundraising, and all of these scenarios, emotion and storytelling can be used to effectively achieve our goals. So now that we know how effective storytelling is, we're going to talk through setting a goal and who we need to meet those goals. So first thing when you're in effective communication is setting a clear and achievable goal. We subconsciously set them every day, trying to get a new funder to donate money, convince a volunteer to show up for a volunteer shift, convince a community member to donate food to the local food bank, persuade the legislature to support our policy, increase awareness, all of those things. Obviously, some are more complicated than others. So for example, Lauren and I did a project this spring working with a coalition to support Medicaid expansion. And the overarching goal was to get a hearing in the legislature. They hadn't had one in 4 years. That was the goal. Obviously, we wanted it to pass too, but that seemed, given the history of that issue in the state, we thought that was a little bit too ambitious. And I would love to tell you that it took one story of a rural hospital closing or one story of a Kansan suffering for lack of care for the legislature to schedule a vote or schedule a hearing. That is not the case. It took a long series and dialogue with multiple storytellers, multiple stories, multiple messengers to get a single hearing. Now, we were successful in getting the first hearing in 4 years, but it was a complex goal that then allowed us to put together a strategy that included a whole bunch of smaller goals and numerous messengers and numerous stories. And again, we were successful in getting that hearing and educating Kansans and incorporating storytellers into our strategy. Once we have a goal, we need to identify the audience. And this is something that is incredibly critical. Sometimes identifying an audience is simple. One donor, one funder, for example. But in a lot of situations, they can be big audiences with diverse perspectives. Your community is a pretty big and diverse group of people. The legislature, our online community, if you're communicating through digital channels. Not only that, there are often secondary audiences. So are we telling a story in a committee hearing? Well, who else is going to hear that? Do we need to consider the media, or is it just a private meeting? When we identify the audience, no matter what you're communicating about and whatever communication you're trying to do, the audience has to be central to your communication planning at all time. Who are they? What do they bring to the conversation? What backgrounds do they have? What motivates them? What are their biases? We all have them. So a little research at the front end on your audience will save you time and money, and it will help you better understand how to reach them. We often select an audience and then move on, but we really need to come back over and over to our audience and figure out, is this the right messenger to communicate with my audience? Is it the right story? Is it the right message? Understanding our audience is central. It is a rare gift to be able to understand the context of a situation and deliver the right story at the right time with the right messenger. And we also need to pay close attention to our messengers and focus on trusted messengers for our audience. Think of all the messengers that you have in your organization: volunteers, staff, other stakeholders, community partners, donors, board members. All of those folks have stories to tell that may connect with a particular audience at a particular time. And let's think of an example on messengers. I'm going to use the CEO of Sunflower Foundation. Brandon Skidmore is going to be our audience today. Let's think about, in our goal. We have to start with a goal. So our goal is to get Brandon Skidmore to eat more apples, okay? Pretty basic goal. And we need to identify which messenger will help us meet this goal. So let's first start with some research. What do we know about Brandon? I mean, he's the CEO of the Sunflower Foundation. He's been there since the spring. Before that, he worked on he worked for Sunflower Foundation on health systems. You can fill this in, please.
He loves peanut butter M&Ms.
That's not
So
apples.
that's our challenge.
That's not apples. Perfect. Okay, previously he also worked at KDHE. He's interested in, I think I heard some talk about modernizing philanthropy, bringing in new funders, private funders, venture funders, all of that. But if you just go to the website, you can also find out some personal information. He's from Augusta, Kansas. He's married and he has 3 kids. And I'm sure if we dug deeper, I'm not gonna embarrass you anymore. But we could probably find out some more. So we need to find a messenger that he trusts, and we're trying to get him to eat some more apples instead of the peanut butter M&Ms. So any ideas?
Peanut butter M&Ms on the apples.
Yeah, just put peanut butter on the M&Ms and then dip. That's a strategy. It's definitely a strategy. Okay, so who might be a good messenger? A Sunflower board member? I don't know. Maybe a high school friend from Augusta? Maybe. We'll see. But also, or maybe, since we're trying to get him to change his, eating habits, maybe a nutritionist or a doctor. Okay, so you see what I'm saying? Like, you have to understand your audience, understand your goal, what you're trying to, and who is a great person to tell us to eat more apples. So once we determine our messenger, we can then create a strategy. And incorporating storytelling, maybe a story about how great apples are, I don't know, would be great. But incorporating stories into our meetings and our daily interactions to promote our work for our organization is really critical. Each of you have stories that you can incorporate into your daily work. But thinking them through ahead of time and planning to do that, we really should plan ahead. Why? Because sharing personal stories is kind of hard. It makes us vulnerable. It's scary. It's scary to stand up here and talk about personal things. And so it really is important that you think through different stories in your life, different things that help you connect with different audiences. Write them out, edit them so they're not really long and rambly, because that's how most of my stories start, really long and rambly. And then practice it. An example of doing this, I did a project last year with a foundation with their board members. And it was a pretty simple prompt. Oftentimes, when we seek new board members, or we go out into the community and we're like, we need somebody who can look at our financials. So let's find an accountant that lives in our community. Or we need to have somebody that can raise money. So let's find a donor maybe that has really great connections. Or we need a communications professional, so they call me. No, but that's not the only thing that those individuals bring to your organization. It's not all about their professional skills. They also have a whole host of personal experiences. So I asked the board members to put together a pitch about why they serve on their board. not referencing their professional experience, not referencing logic and facts, but referencing their personal experience. And they put these together, and one board member had experienced poverty and hardship as a child. They had watched their parents struggle to put food on the table, and they understood that that foundation and the work that they did and food insecurity was vital to helping families similar to theirs. Another board member had a high school friend who lost a parent due to addiction, and that triggered their service. The programming that the foundation was working on related to opioid addiction was something that spoke to them personally. Now, those stories are far different than just saying, I'm an accountant and they need me to look at the financials. Now, accountants are incredibly important, and I am really bad at math, but that's not the only thing that they bring to the table. They have a whole huge host of stories that they can tell that may be more effective in conveying why they give time to this organization. Because we're all busy, and you have to be motivated to give your free time away, right? And so why are you doing it? So leveraging those stories and those stakeholders and the stories of our volunteers in an effective way, but also in a respectful way. So if you're using storytellers or you're asking somebody to share their story, you have to be very respectful and you have to be a good steward of their story, which means you have to get permission, you have to talk to them about it, and you have to prepare them to share their story, or your story, same way. One great example that I've seen in my community is from the Bert Nash fundraising breakfast. Bert Nash people, raise your hand. Okay. Each year, the Bert Nash hosts a community fundraising breakfast. And it is similar to probably many events. Raise your hand if you do volunteer breakfasts, fundraising breakfasts or fundraising events. Probably, hopefully we all do at some point. And just like any fundraising event, there are speakers, they talk about the goals of the organization, and the goal is ultimately to get the folks in attendance to make a pledge, fundraising pledge or a donation. Simple enough. Now, they could just give us a list of their accomplishments, how many people they serve, what services they offer, or maybe some stats, 21 million adults, like over 8% of the population has at least one major depressive episode in a year. But what they do, typically, for the most part, is they delegate the storytelling to their clients and the families of their clients and the people that they serve, that utilize their services. Often there is a client in person that tells their story. They have a video that tells the story of several patients and their mental health journey with Bert Nash. It's incredibly moving. The first time I attended that breakfast was at the request of a good friend of mine, Julia. So to back up really quick, a year earlier, Julia had been hospitalized for a mental health emergency. At the time, I was really close with her husband through work, and Julia and I were definitely acquaintances, but I didn't know her nearly as well. And I wasn't certain what had happened, but I did what good friends do, and I delivered a lasagna to their house when she returned. At the time, my youngest daughter was pretty little, and I was staying home and working less. And in the weeks after Julia's release from the hospital, we began walking together in the morning. I didn't pry into what had happened. I honestly just tried to be there to listen if she wanted to talk, but also just be a distraction if she didn't. And some days she was good, and some days she wasn't. And we spent many mornings walking together, drinking coffee, and day by day she improved. Some time passed and she began to work again. She got a part-time job actually at Bert Nash, and we walked less, which I took as an incredibly good sign despite missing her desperately. So then she invited me to the breakfast, and I had never been, and went that morning expecting a typical fundraising event. I knew she was going to give a speech, but I didn't really know that much. And it wasn't until that morning, the morning of that breakfast, that I fully appreciated how close we'd come to losing her the year before. Julia stood on that stage and courageously told her story, the details of her serious mental health struggles, her suicidal thoughts, and what brought her to seek help. And she talked about her recovery with Bert Nash. Julia is an eloquent writer, and her speech that morning was beautiful, and I am not doing it justice here today. She now teaches classes in mental health first aid through Bert Nash, and she continues to be an inspiration to me every single day. This example of storytelling cut to my core, and every year now when I attend this breakfast, I remember that morning and the courage that it took for her to stand on that stage and tell her story. And every year, the story that one of their clients tells. And I'm inspired by the numerous stories in our community that are helped by their services. Other organizations do similar events and incorporate stories to connect with their communities. The folks at Bert Nash understand the importance of connection. They also understand how common mental health struggles are, and that sharing stories like this destigmatizes mental health care and engages the community. We all have stories from our lives and critical perspectives that improve and promote our work or an issue or our organization. Stories that inspire, engage, persuade, cause action, build bridges, and demonstrate our values. Figuring out how to incorporate them into our work to build human connection and to meet our goals as an organization is key. We all have the tools, we all have the stories, you all have the messengers. We are just a collection of stories, and our organizations are a collection of stories, and how we pull those together to share with our donors, our partners, our community members will determine our success. Thank you for joining us this week. Thank you for sharing all of your challenges, the opportunities you have, your questions, and learning with us, with the Sunflower Foundation. Thank you again to Brandon and to Elizabeth and Kelly and all of the team for putting this together. I am happy to take a couple of questions if there's time. I know you guys are probably ready for the day to be done. But I look forward to communicating and talking with you more in the future and hearing your stories and hearing how we can be supportive to all of you. Thank you so much.
I've got a quick question to start us off, if that's okay.
Please.
And this might be too down in the weeds, but I bet you know. Does science tell us what is the best length for a story? Is it 3 minutes, 5 minutes? Because you mentioned, think of your story and then edit it down.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really important fact to know.
Yeah, so I think, I would say that's dependent on your audience and your goal and all of that. If you are trying to reach someone and you're doing it on social media and it's a very short, you think they're probably scrolling, or you're not going to have potentially their attention for very long. I would keep it shorter the better. I think there was a study recently that said teenage attention span is down to 8 seconds, which is alarming, but also explains why I can't have a conversation with my children. But some things are more complicated, and they take a little bit more time to explain. There's more context. So I would start with the goal, but also, again, when we write, we all need an editor. I'm a huge Taylor Swift fan, as I said, and she needed an editor on the last album. Yeah. Sorry, I know. But we all need an editor. We have to cut down from where we are. So I would say the shorter the better. If you can convey it in 30 seconds, great. We can convey quite a lot in 30 seconds, actually, if we're very strategic about our word choice, tone, the imagery of what we're putting. If we're doing a video that's 30 seconds, there's a whole lot of ways you can speak to your audience that aren't just the words that are coming out of your mouth. There's, visual cues, there's music cues, there's, all kinds of things. So shorter the better. but also recognizing that there are some things that, I mean, the video, how long is your guys' video that you usually do?
That's about 8 minutes.
Yeah, so it's longer, yeah.
Each client is like oh boy. Sorry. That's okay. Oh, sorry. So we do like 3 client stories in that 7-minute video, and they're about 2 minutes each. But sometimes we weave them in and out, and sometimes they're just in blocks.
So I think that it depends. Like if you have like a trapped audience, then you can probably have something longer, you know? But if you're fighting for attention with everything else that's on the interwebs, then the shorter the better.
Yeah, the live testimonial that Julia did was about 3 to 4 minutes.
And it sounds like you're also saying, don't, authentic and lengthy are not synonymous. Like you can still be very genuine and heartwarming with your story, but with a pared down, edited version.
Right.
Like sometimes I think
Yeah.
we think speaking from the heart means rambling.
Right. I mean, I would use an example. So we had 2 sessions of this, right? 2, you know, and so I gave roughly this speech 2 days ago. And it's better this time because I've done it now twice. But practice matters. And so we can, the first time I tell a story, there's all these other like random facts that I feel like I need to throw in, or like, some tangents maybe. Cut those out and then retell. And then also ask somebody to edit for you or to read it, because if you're trying to convey something to an audience that may not have your background in the issue that you work on, then you need to make sure you're not, using language or jargon that they don't understand, and that, and we also all have the context in our head. So when I'm telling a story about my grandpa, like I know all the things that happened. Now, what out of those things did I need to say out loud to you all? Without leaving out important context and all of that. So edit, write it out. You probably all speak to different organizations, to different community. If you get asked to be on a panel or different things, there's a lot of stories that we can tell that explain lessons learned. The story I told at the beginning about losing my job. Like I've told that before because it's important for people to understand that we fail. And sometimes those failures are like the greatest things that's happened in our lives and open doors that we never even expected. Now, the first time I told that story, it was, not that great and kind of like meandering and also painful to tell. So the more we tell the story, the easier it is for us. Now, quite honestly, the first time I told some of those stories that I told today, I didn't make it through. Because it's still emotional to me. And so desensitizing myself to telling those stories, or telling the stories and getting comfortable telling those stories is really important. So practice makes as close to perfect as we can get.
And if I may ask a follow-up, is that okay with everyone?
Yeah, I just want to make sure if anybody else has questions.
Is it more effective to tell someone else's story in and of itself, or do you need, as the storyteller, to insert yourself in that, if that makes sense?
So I don't think that we should try to speak for other people. So if you notice, when I told Julia's story, I did not actually tell Julia's story. I told my perception of Julia's story and the way Julia's story interacted in my life. And so I would say, like, when you are, incorporating storytellers or other folks that you work with in your community, and you're asking them to tell their story, you need to be very careful with that, because it is something that's incredibly personal to them, and we have to be careful, and we have to be good stewards of those stories. And so I would say when I tell a story, it's usually through my perception of the experience, even if it's like referencing somebody else's story. And to be clear, I talked to Julia about talking about this to make sure it was okay. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's just really important, but also helping people prepare. Like if you're asking them to, like, for example, if you're asking a donor or a board member to share a personal story about why something that happened in their lives that caused them to serve on your board, and it's like a personal story, an emotional story maybe, ask them, and then also like help them prepare to do it. Don't just kind of scoot them out there and be like, good luck. You need to help them because it is a vulnerable thing to do. But it's also the way we connect. I'm sure that there are lots of you who have experiences, painful losses, painful struggles, failures in your life, and those aren't great to talk about. And so helping, if you're expecting other folks to do it as well, helping them do it is really important. Any questions from the audience? You all have had such a great week, and I'm sure you're exhausted and ready to go home for the weekend. So thank you again for coming. Thanks to Sunflower Foundation for having us.
So much.